The German Way of War, a lesson in tactical management, written by Jaap-Jan Brouwer and published by Pen and Sword Books. Please follow our slides. It explains why the German army was such a clever, formidable and flexible fighting force. The German Way of War. Germany and the German army lost 2 wars in the last century. But the relative battlefield performance in World War I was 3.5 and in World War II was 1.5 to 2.5 higher than their adversaries. This meaning, for every German soldier wounded or killed, 3.5, respectively 1.5 to 2.5 Allied soldier was wounded or killed. Now, what is this based on? And how did they achieve that? Historic evidence. The Historic Evaluation and Research Organization of Trevor Dupuy, Colonel of the United States Army, analyzed more than 40 battles in the Second World War. His conclusion was, the record shows that the Germans consistently outfought the far more numerous Allied armies that eventually defeated them. On a man-to-man basis, the German ground soldiers consistently inflicted casualties at about a 50% higher rate than they incurred from the opposing British and American troops under all circumstances. The Battle of Jena as a turning point. How did they achieve that? They did it by losing the Battle of Jena in 1806, resulting in the loss of 38,000 men and a large part of their country to France. And by evaluating the reasons for their defeat. They concluded that the battlefield was a chaos. And this chaos doomed every attempt of centralized command and control. The time lag between messengers from the front line to the commanders at the rear and back again was so extensive that they were only relevant for a war fought a couple of hours previous. One had to decentralize the decision-making to the lowest possible level, giving the commander in the field the maximum freedom to act. Auftragstaktik. They called their command concept Auftragstaktik, führen durch Aufträge, which means leading by assignment. You define what should be reached and not how it should be reached. That was left for the commander in the field to be decided upon. It had all modern elements as decentralized decision-making, agility, leading by example, interdepartmental cooperation, scrums, and so forth. It makes decision-making in a very fast-changing environment possible. The contradiction. The author Martin von Creveld concludes in his book Fighting Power that, contrary to the widely held clichés about blind obedience or cadaver Gehorsamkeit and Prussian discipline, the German army had, at least from the time of Moltke the Elder, emphasized the crucial importance of individual initiative and responsibility, even at the lowest levels. And on closer inspection, the picture of an army evolved that successfully combined opposing characteristics such as obedience and initiative, drill and creativity, authority and independence, as stated by Oeting in his book Auftragstaktik. How did they achieve this? In a series of presentations, we will try to find the answer and analyze the Prussian German army in more detail. We will have a closer look at Auftragstaktik, Officer Corps, men and teams, Kampfgruppen, General Staff, and lessons to be learned. Auftragstaktik, history and application. Von Moltke, the spiritual father of Auftragstaktik. Von Moltke, chief of staff of the Prussian army in the second half of the 19th century, can be seen as the spiritual father of Auftragstaktik. No plan survives the first contact with the main body of the enemy. That was his statement. History. The first concept dates from 1812. Later development was speeded up by the introduction of the breech-loading rifle, resulting in a much higher rate of fire. The concept was successful during the wars against Denmark, Austria and France during the period 1860–1870, but it came to a standstill in the mud of the First World War. It was reintroduced in the form of Hutier tactics, very small formations of soldiers, so-called Stoßtruppen, consisting of 2 to 4 men, would infiltrate in the front. Extreme decentralization of decision-making. Between the wars, it was the leading organizational principle of the German army, the Reichswehr and the Wehrmacht. Blitzkrieg. The combination of Auftragstaktik, Panzers und Panzergrenadiere made Blitzkrieg possible. Fast-moving armored columns that ripped the enemy forces behind the front once broken apart. Apart from this, the German tactics contained 4 basic elements. Impact equals mass times speed, Schwerpunkt, Aufklärung, deep penetrations behind the front. Generating impact. Preparation. Up front, you should know the terrain and you should know your men and invest in reconnaissance of the enemy line. Focus, Schwerpunkt. Cooperation between the arms in the form of Kampfgruppen. Speed. The more speed, the higher the impact. Mass. The less mass, the more speed you need. Exploration. If the attack is successful, you should be well prepared for the next move. And these are the key success factors. The Allied way. Preparation, mostly staff work, far from the front line and little or no attention in general to reconnaissance. Focus, no focus, attack on a broad front. Cooperation, inter-arms cooperation was not part of the Allied doctrine. Speed, slow, centralized decision-making. Mass, more than enough mass. A 3-to-1 superiority was the key to success, according to Montgomery, and the basic reason for the Allied success. Continuation, not planned for, so after the breakthrough, the front stabilized, the Germans retaking their positions. The German Schwerpunkt. Schwerpunkt is the combination of the weakest point in the enemy line, the strength of your own forces at that point, and the most important tactical targets behind the front to be reached. The Germans always looked for this Schwerpunkt and fought for information. They did this by reconnaissance in force, aggressive reconnaissance by the Aufklärungsabteilung, a heavily armed and armored unit of the division. Once found, the artillery, tanks, infantry, engineers, etc. would focus on this point. The Allied broad front. The Allies almost always attacked on a broad front, starting with a massive artillery or aerial bombardment. But heavy bombers cannot make buildings simply disappear, and the Germans always left sniper teams behind in the ruins, causing delays for up to 48 hours. Even weak fronts, like Ardennes 1944 or the Rhineland in 1945, would hold because the Allied forces were not concentrating their forces. And even if there was a breakthrough, there was no follow-up. The German front did not collapse by itself. The German offensive. After the Schwerpunkt was spotted, The offensive itself has 4 phases: the break-in phase, breakthrough phase, breakout phase, and the pursuit phase. The break-in phase. Preparatory artillery bombardment, bombing by the Luftwaffe. First wave of panzers and panzergrenadieren. They punched a hole in the enemy line, eliminated the enemy artillery positions, and silenced enemy anti-tank guns. The breakthrough phase. Second wave of panzers and panzergrenadieren. They cleared pockets of resistance, maintained the breach, protected the flanks and the communication lines. They cleared the way for the third wave. The breakout phase. Third wave. Overpowered by the enemy's C3I command structure, the brains, and what was left of the resistance. Resistance collapses because C3I capacity is destroyed. Coordinated resistance is no longer possible. Panzer and panzergrenadieren advanced deep into the enemy hinterland, leaving the infantry to deal with pockets of resistance that might remain behind the first waves of attack. The pursuit phase. This phase started the moment the enemy began to pull back in any numbers or simply retreated en masse. The regrouping of the enemy forces should be prevented by continuing to pursue them relentlessly. If possible, the retreating enemy should be cut off by swift maneuvers and by ever deeper penetrations into areas behind the front. The phase ended by encircling and mopping up the enemy forces, and sometimes in very large numbers. The Allied doctrine. The Allies never mastered this way of fighting battles. The Germans were never afraid of being encircled because of the Allied centralized decision-making and long response time. The Allies qualified their own actions as sluggish or lackluster, and the level of their officers as almost timid on the operational and tactical level. For instance, in Italy in 1944, the pursuit between Rome and the Arno is misnamed. It was a rapid advance, but pursuit implies getting on the heels of the Germans. The Germans in these actions controlled our pursuit, our rate of advance. The operations between Rome and the Arno were far from a rout. It was a calculated withdrawal. Relevant elements. The above shows some interesting differences between the German army and its opponents. But what did the Germans do or have that the Allied did not do or have? That is the question. Auftragstaktik gives a first glance of the German way of war, but it needs a sophisticated organization and professional officer corps and very well-trained men. In the next part of the series, we will show you how the Prussian German army was forced into such a formidable, clever and flexible fighting force. Relevant elements. In the next part of the series, we will have a look at the officer corps, men and teams, Kampfgruppen, general stab, and lessons to be learned. Are you interested? Would you like to learn more? Then read the book, The German Way of War, a lesson in tactical management, published by Pen & Sword Books. It analyzes the Prussian German army and its opponents and the way they were organized. The analysis is illustrated with more than 40 cases.